So our first speaker this afternoon is Suilin Lavelle, who's from Edinburgh.
Thank you. So when I agreed to give a talk here, I thought it would be super easy. All I needed to do was dig out some thoughts on nativism and then apply them to theory of mind, which is what I'm really interested in, and then say some words for and against nativism in theory of mind. Probably come down on the side of nativism because that's how I was brought up. That's how they bring you up in Sheffield, to be nativists. And that would be the end of it, and that would be a nice talk. But it wasn't quite so easy as all that. So I thought I'd start with this because when we present the nativist debate, or rather when I present the nativism, empiricism debate at an undergraduate level, the first thing that we say is, look, it's not, it's a spectrum, right? So nobody thinks that the mind is a blank slate. Since the days of Leibniz, we've got over that. And nobody thinks that everything is innate, because obviously people are different. So that can't be the case either. And Quine, who is no friend to the nativist, really, sort of says the behaviorist is knowingly and cheerfully up to his neck in innate mechanisms. And by behaviorism here, what he was referring to is kind of associationist behaviorism. So the battle lines aren't as clear as perhaps we might want them to be. It's not a nice, neat debate that we can carve up. And so the way in which this debate is often introduced is, well, the question isn't so much whether there is innate stuff, but how much innate stuff there is. So how many cognitive structures and what kind of cognitive content constitutes not being learned? And what kind of cognitive structures and what kind of content is innate? So a new debate kind of arose, which was for any cognitive structure, S, is it learned or is it innate? And let's do some empirical work to find out what the answer is. So I thought, well, I'm going to look at the state of nativism in mind reading. So mind reading, I'm going to give as sort of quick definition, is the ability to attribute psychological states to other people. I'm going to use it interchangeably with theory of mind for now. I know for some of you who will know this debate really well, that will be uncomfortable, but tough. You can live with it. Mind reading and theory of mind, I'm just going to say, is the ability to attribute psychological states to other people. And there's, two main views that I wanted to look at. I wanted to look at empiricist accounts of mind reading, which are mainly associated with Henry Wellman and Alison Gopnik. And this is quite cool because Henry Wellman just has a book out at the end of last year called Making Minds. So it was a good excuse to have a look at that book and sort of see what the state of play was in contemporary mind reading. And I was going to contrast that with nativist modular accounts of mind reading. So the one I'm going to look at is that proposed by the philosopher Peter Carruthers. But it's also associated with psychologists like René Baillargeon, Brian Scholl, and Alan Leslie. And they maintain that mind reading, that is, our ability to attribute psychological states to others, is innately channeled. And particularly, like obviously there's a lot of psychological states we can attribute, but we're going to focus today on a specific type of psychological state, which is the ability to attribute beliefs to other people and the ability to attribute false beliefs to other people. And what you find in this debate, as in with any, is that the problem spaces, so what Kuhn called problem spaces, that is, the problems that you think are really important, the critical ones that you need to explain, are different according to each side. So they prioritize different spaces, they prioritize different puzzles. So the problem that Peter Carruthers prioritizes is how it is that young infants appear to be very competent at attributing certain kinds of mental states, yet 3- and 4-year-olds are not. What's going on there? I'm going to talk a little bit more about these problems as we go along. This is just to give you a broad overview. And he doesn't really talk so much about differences. He likes to gloss over the differences. So what you find in the writing is something along the lines of, generally by the age of 4, children have achieved X. But if you're an empiricist, if you're Henry Wellman, then you find differences really interesting. Those are the problem spaces that you prioritize. Those are the problems that you think a theory of mind really needs to tackle. So you prioritize those and say, no, it's not good enough to say, broadly speaking, by the age of 4, children can do X. We need to look at the variations in children, and we need to look at the variations both sort of within cultures and across cultures, and that's what's going to yield the most interesting questions, the most interesting data for us. And Wellman isn't so worried about infant competencies. He talks about them a little bit, but it's just not a problem. It's not something that he sees as a really important problem that needs to be addressed. And because of these different problem spaces, because of the different problems that these accounts prioritize, it then makes it sometimes quite difficult to evaluate them because they're focusing very much on different things. And this was something that I kind of encountered in going along researching this talk. We'll come back to this table, but this is just to show you what the priorities are of the different accounts. So in order to kind of address this problem space, you will find in Carruthers writing occasionally, of course there's learning, and you just, if there's differences, then we put them down to learning. And as we'll see, the way that Henry Wellman tries to deal with the problem of infant competency is just to deny that infants are as clever as we think that they are. That's a legitimate move. I don't mean that in a facetious way. But here's the issue I came up with, is that I found it increasingly difficult to pull the views apart. So perhaps in other debates in psychology and philosophy, people have, as Jennifer suggested at the start of this, people are kind of moving away from the rhetoric of what's innate and what is not. But I kind of feel in this field, that is how we attribute psychological states to each other, there is still quite a raging debate about how many innate mechanisms there are and what can we tell is innate and not innate. The consequence being that I found is that the views seem to merge together because you find a nativist view saying, well, what we think is innate is a domain-specific learning mechanism. And on the empiricist view, you say, well, we think that there are learning mechanisms too. We think they're domain-specific. And this is quite interesting because it means that we have these two views that traditionally, and arguably still at conferences, see themselves as banging their heads against each other and proposing very different research programs. But my worry is that perhaps they aren't so different as they might originally appear. And I proposed this to one of the people in this debate. I proposed this to Henry Wellman, and he disagreed. He thought there really was still ground to fight over. So kind of the last third of this talk, we'll come on to this later, is I want to look at some of the strategies we might use to pull these two views apart. How is it that we can tell whether what we've got is an empirical account or a more nativist account of learning? And I'm going to do this by looking at the nature. We'll look a little bit about Bayesian hypotheses of learning and the nature of the priors that are used in Bayesian learning. And I'm going to look at the question of when an innate structure changes in response to the environment, is that learning? Or is that something else? Because that might give us some insight into what's going on. And finally, and this is the one that's really, really puzzling me at the moment, is how can empirical work help? Because the more I think about it, the more both accounts, this nativist modular account and this empiricist learning account, are making very similar predictions. And they are both acknowledging that, yes, the environment has a big part to play in how infants come to learn about other minds. And they're also learning that there seem to be some sort of aspects of infant minds that are innately channeled. But if they can explain all the same empirical work and they're yielding the same kind of predictions, then from a philosophy of science perspective, that then makes it very difficult to say, well, what are the differences here? And is it going to be empirical work that is able to give us an insight into the nature of the structures that are underlying mind reading, or do we need to look somewhere else? Is it more of a conceptual task for people like me, for philosophers? So how are we going to make progress in this debate? Because I feel like we may have reached a stalemate. So that's a little overview of what I'd like to discuss. So in the next section, I'd just like to introduce you to some of the data. Now, this debate's been raging for about 30 years, so obviously there's a small cottage industry in churning out false belief tasks for children to do. What I want to do is just pick out some of the most salient points, some of the points that I think any theory of mind reading needs to cover and accommodate, and then turn to see how the different theories do accommodate these. So first off, we have what's called verbal or explicit response false belief tasks. So false beliefs just means that are you able to understand that someone else's perspective, someone else might have a different belief about the world to yourself. And back in 1983, Wimmer and Perner, Josef Perner and Hans Wimmer, put forward a test to try and check this in 3- and 4-year-old children. It came in response to an earlier paper which was trying to see whether chimpanzees could appreciate whether other people had false belief. And in response to that paper, 2 philosophers, Daniel Dennett and someone else, Gilbert Harman. Daniel Dennett and Gilbert Harman said, this is all very good, but we don't even know if children can do this. And the developmental psychologist said, good point, we don't. Let's see whether they can. And the false belief task was born. So this is actually illustrated here as Simon Baron-Cohen's version of the false belief task. So you have 3- and 4-year-old children, and they watch something like this. This is Sally. She has a basket. This is Anne, who has a box. Sally has a marble, which she puts into the basket and goes out for a walk. Anne takes the marble, puts it out of the basket, puts it in the box. Sally comes back and she wants to play with her marble. Where will Sally look for the marble? And 3-year-olds will consistently say she will look in the box. She will look where the marble is. And 4-year-olds seem to understand that Sally is going to look where she last left the marble. That is, where Sally believes the marble to be, even though that belief is false. And for about 20 years, everyone accepted this is great. So 4 years old, you can do false belief. You can attribute false beliefs to others. Prior to 4 years old, you can't. That's our data point. Let's try and generate some explanations for this. And all sorts of variations were found. So for example, if you have siblings, then you're able to pass this test much faster than if you are an only child. Possibly because the environment that you're in, you have people who cheat you a lot and hide your stuff. And you're much faster at tracking other people's beliefs, whereas possibly with only children, their parents are more honest with them than a sibling might be, and doesn't hide your toys and then try and deceive you as to where your favorite things are. So if you have siblings, this accelerates your understanding of false belief. But then in 2005, Christina Nishi and René Baillargeon put a really strong challenge to this. And they did this through a study with 15-month-old infants. And the methodology that they used is the violation of expectation methodology. So the violation of expectation methodology says that infants will look longer at an event that surprises them. So this is a nice methodology because you don't have to talk to them. You don't have to get them to give a response that requires any kind of complicated executive functions like pointing. You just measure a kind of involuntary response, which is how long they look at a particular event. And a longer looking time suggests surprise, and surprise suggests that your expectation has been violated. That is, what you have seen occur violates what you anticipated was going to happen. So in the first stage, you habituate the children to a particular event. So this is 15-month-old infants. They see an experimenter play with a watermelon slice, and she pops it in a green box. And they watch this several times till they dishabituate, so they look away. That's boring. And then you show the infant a belief induction trial. I'm only showing you one here. There were 4 different conditions, but I'm just going to go through a false belief condition. But you can ask me about them if you would like to. So the experimenter disappears, a wall comes up, and the watermelon moves from the green box, where she left it, to the yellow box. And then you show the infant one of two scenes. You either show the green box condition, which is the experimenter coming in and reaching into the green box, or you show the yellow box condition, which is the experimenter putting her hand in the yellow box. And what Anishi and Baillargeon discovered was that when infants saw this outcome from this, so they see the watermelon slice move and the experimenter come back and reach into the green box, they look away. They dishabituate. That's boring. If they see the person come back and reach into the yellow box, which is where the toy is now, but not where the experimenter should think the toy is, they stare. So there's a significant increase in looking time. And they found this across all conditions. So whenever the experimenter acted in a way that didn't cohere with her belief, then be that belief a true belief or a false belief, the infants were surprised. The infants looked for a significantly longer period of time at that event. And this led Anishi and Baillargeon to say this. They said these results suggest that 15-month-old infants already possess, at least in a rudimentary and implicit form, a representational theory of mind. They realize that others act on the basis of their beliefs, and that these beliefs are representations that may or may not mirror reality. So apart from the interpretation, does anyone have questions about the methodology? Are we happy? Yes?
I actually just have a question about whether the controllers included a couple of cases. I feel like I should know this better, but did they have a condition in which the experimenter looked in a box that a mobile watermelon had traveled into that was congruent with what the experimenter should have expected before?
Yes, so they did have a condition where the experimenter leaves it in the green box, and she's watching, and the watermelon moves in front of the...
And returns.
So there's one where it peeks out and returns into the green, and there's another where it comes out and trundles all the way across to yellow, with the experimenter watching. Sorry, there were lots of controls, but I tend not to show them because people get confused. Any other questions about the methodology?
In the initial training, did the experimenters always go to the green box, or did they do both green and yellow?
They did both green and yellow, so some infants saw this. Yeah, there was a balance across both conditions. You can tell you guys are not philosophers. You ask sensible questions about the methodology. Like, okay. So since 2005, these results have been replicated in a variety of ways. Suilin and colleagues have shown this at 13 months. Vanetti and Southgate have possibly shown it at 6 months, though their methodology is slightly different, and I'm not quite sure about it. But the upshot is that this has been replicated. It's been replicated a lot, that 15-month-old, well, certainly from 7 months old, robustly, infants' looking time seem to suggest that they understand that the other person has a false belief. This has also been replicated in infants across the world. So in this paper that lots of you may know, Henrik Heine Norenzayan, The Weirdest People in the World. So this was a paper that pointed out that 97% of psychological studies in 2010, so the period measured between, I think, 2003 and 2010, 96% of the psychological sample came from countries with only 12% of the world's population. So that is, they were testing children mainly in Northern Europe and America and Australia, but not children from across the world. And they've tried to rectify this both with the verbal and non-verbal false belief task. So with the verbal false belief task, that is something like the Maxi task, what they discovered was that, yes, pretty much the same. Children across the world, or across different cultures, seem to be able to pass that kind of task at about the age of 4. And that seems to be a universal. But we weren't sure what the results were for looking time studies, like the one that Anishi and Baillargeon did. So a group of researchers sponsored, kind of as part of the AHRC Culture and the Mind project, which was based at Sheffield, set out to do violation of expectation studies in 3 different cultures. So they chose the Shuar of Ecuador, the Yasawan in Fiji, and children in children in Suilin province in China. The reason they chose these studies is that these children have a very different experience of the world to Western infants. So in Ecuador, children are often carried on the back, so they have less face-to-face contact with adults. Yasawan in Fiji, here's a quote from Barrett and colleagues where he says that Yasawan children are typically regarded as the lowest ranking members of Yasawan society. So not only are they regarded as low ranking, parents also report that they don't understand language, cannot think or feel pain or pleasure until well into the second year of life. And independent studies have kind of supported this by showing that there's much less child-directed speech in these groups. So people talk to their children less, and they certainly don't talk about their psychological states. So whereas in the West, it might be okay for you to say, oh, mummy's just feeling sad, or mummy wants a coffee, so she's going over to the cupboard. This sort of constant narrative on what you're thinking is not a big part of these cultures, and particularly in the Pacific Islands. It's taboo almost to talk about psychological states and to talk about other psychological states. So infants have a very different perspective of the world. So they ran violation of expectation studies using artifacts that were familiar to the children, so just cups in this case for the Suilin child here. And the studies were filmed and then they were analysed afterwards, sort of back in the lab, not on site. And what they discovered was exactly the same as Anishi and Bayajan studies. So infants in Suilin province in China, in Ecuador, and in Fiji, their looking time all suggested that they expected the experimenter to behave in a way that cohered with her beliefs. So this is another interesting data point. So this very early kind of false belief indicators that Anishi and Bayajan uncovered appear to be, if not universal, then certainly prominent in other cultures, and cultures that are very different from Western cultures. An outlier here is children, infants who are deaf, but who have hearing parents. So deaf children with hearing parents have obviously a much more different kind of communication experience, because their parents don't communicate with them quite so much because they're learning sign language too. And what Marek Maristow and his colleagues discovered was, again, with 11-month-old infants and something similar to the Anishi and Bayajan task, there was no difference in looking time. So deaf children born to hearing parents did not show the same response as all these other children. And this was contrasted with deaf children born to deaf parents and also hearing children. So just a brief summary. From 7 months old onwards, your looking behavior suggests some understanding of false belief. And this appears to be universal, or at least we see it across different cultures. But it's not the case for deaf infants with hearing parents. And none of these children are passing false belief tasks, verbal false belief tasks like the Sally Ann task, till 4 years old. And for deaf children of hearing parents, that's much later. It's about 7 or 8 years old. What does this tell us? Well, this tells us that whatever your account of mind reading, whatever story you want to tell, be it an empiricist one or a more nativist heavy one, it needs to accommodate these data. And specifically, it needs to accommodate what I'm going to call the gap between apparent infant's precociousness and the performance of 3- and 4-year-olds on verbal false belief tasks. Last piece of data I'd like to put forward before we look at the theories in more detail. This is the scaling of theory of mind tasks. So far I've just talked about false belief. But of course, there's much more to understanding another person's psychological life than being able to attribute false beliefs to them. That's just one aspect of understanding another's psychological states. And Henry Wellman has done some fascinating studies where he tries to track the development of a child's understanding of another's psychological state. So he begins with diverse desires, which he believes that comes out at about 2 years, 7 months. Diverse desires are tests looking into whether you understand that someone else has a different desire to you. So Rapaccioli and Gottmanik's work is the classic in this. You give a child broccoli and you give them goldfish crackers. And the adult picks up the broccoli and goes, this is absolutely delicious. Then you give the child a choice of, they give the child goldfish crackers and broccoli, and they're allowed to feed the adult one or the other. And prior to about 2.5 years old, they just find it incredulous that you could possibly want broccoli and give the adult goldfish crackers all the time, even though the adult has specifically said, broccoli is so good, I love it. But after 2.5 years old, they seem to recognize that perhaps this adult's taste buds really are different. Perhaps this adult has different desires to me, and they'll start to give the adult broccoli instead of goldfish crackers. So that's kind of one of the early signs in a behavioral test of a child kind of appreciating that your psychology could be different from theirs. The next step is diverse beliefs. So that's when you understand that two people, me and someone else, have different beliefs about something. So I might think that the dog is in the garage, and you might think that the dog is in the bedroom, for instance. And the child never gets to see where the dog is, but she has to predict whether, if you think the dog is in the bedroom, where are you going to look for it? So this isn't a false belief, this is just diverse beliefs. You and I think different things, but neither of us knows which is actually the case. The next step is knowledge access, which is when you start to understand that other people can be ignorant of things. So you put something in a container, and you put it in a drawer, and you ask whether the other person who's never seen the drawer before, never seen inside the container, knows what is there. So they understand that other people can be ignorant. And the answer is yes. So about 3.5 years old, we get knowledge access. The next step is false belief that I've talked about. And then finally, at about 5 years, children can understand hidden emotion, which is that somebody can feel one way but look another way. So from about sort of 2 years, 8 months through to 5 years, there is this development of understanding of another person's psychology. And this, first of all, was done with children in Germany and America and Australia. And this series of development is robust across all children. So they achieve each of these milestones in this order. There might be differences in timing, but the order is the same. You first of all get diverse desires, then diverse beliefs, till at the end you get hidden emotions. So this is another bit of data to think about, is sort of thinking beyond the false belief box to something a bit wider, which is a general understanding of another's psychology and the steps that one goes through before one gets to hidden emotion. These steps seem to be fairly robust and chronologically in the same order for children everywhere. But I'm going to come back to this in a moment. So that's all the data that I would like to present and think about. So the next section, I want to introduce the two theories that maintain that they're opposed to each other and try and pull apart exactly where they make different predictions, what their differences are. My motivation for picking the two theories that I've introduced, the constructivist and the kind of nativist modular account, is basically that because on surface level, they're the ones that seem most clearly opposed. And also the authors that I've chosen just because they've done the most work in detailing their account. Okay, sorry, I'll come back to that. So nativist modularity, first of all. So it used to be the case, as with so much of cognitive science, that modules were associated with Fodor. But that isn't the case so much anymore. So 1983, modularity of mind. It's now possible to talk about modules without meaning Fodorian modules, just like it's possible to talk about representations without meaning Fodor's representations. So Fodor got the ball rolling, but we've moved away from some of these ideas since. So when I'm talking about modularity, I'm not necessarily talking, in fact, I'm definitely not talking Fodorian modularity. So recent views of modules don't share all the features associated with Fodorian modules. In particular, there's a more nuanced view of encapsulation. So the idea isn't so much that you have these independent cognitive structures, all of which work independently of each other. It's more that you have discrete cognitive structures which only have access to certain amounts of information. So they are connected, there's limited connectivity, but they're not completely encapsulated in the way that Fodor suggested. The focus now is more on functional encapsulation. So the idea that we individuate the cognitive structures by what it is that they do. So if you have a cognitive structure that allows you to recognize faces, you can't use that also to do maths or to do something else. The encapsulation is described in a functional way. So we individuate modules by what it is that they do. Each module has one function, and it can't be co-opted to take on another function. And so Carruthers describes modules as isolable functional subcomponents. So they can be isolated. You can pick them out according to their function. And they're usually subcomponents of a bigger system. So they feed into a bigger system. The second major contrast with Fodor is that people like Carruthers maintain that modules are domain-specific learning mechanisms. So Carruthers says this. He says, many of the modules postulated by evolutionary psychologists and others are innate learning mechanisms. Now, Fodor, there's many things that he gets angry about, but learning is one of the things he gets extremely angry about. He doesn't really think it happens. So this is another way in which we're moving away from the Fodorian concept of module. We're saying that we're individuating it by its function, and we're saying that its function is to allow you to learn about specific bits of the world. So you might have a theory of mind module, a module that allows you to learn about other people's psychological states. A consequence of seeing modules as learning mechanisms is that you can have the same type of module across a population which has different token outcomes. So, for example, someone like Clark Barrett believes that we have a predator detecting module, that is, specific cognitive structure that allows us to detect predators in our environment. And this module is kind of sensitive to certain environmental inputs, like moving in a stealthy way or maybe displaying particular colors. But Barrett says, that doesn't mean that an Inuit child will see a snake as a predator necessarily. What it means is that humans everywhere are able and gain the ability to detect predators in their environment. And that ability is kind of attributed to this predator detecting module, but the token outcome will depend on the environment that you're in. So it's not blind to the environment. The environment does play a role. But you have a kind of cognitive structure that allows you to detect what in your environment is a predator. So there is interplay between the environment and the modular system. And of course, they have to have that in order to make their cognitive view viable. When it comes to understanding the data that I presented in the previous section, here's the explanation that's given. So Carruthers says the infant mind-reading hypothesis postulates an innately channeled body of core knowledge or an innately structured processing mechanism, or both, with an internal structure that approximates a simple theory of mind. So this is why I'm happy to put Carruthers in a nativist kind of category, in a nativist box, because he says quite specifically that he thinks theory of mind, this ability to reason about other psychological states, is innately channeled. Well, what does innately channeled mean? So Richard Samuels, back in 2002, when he was trying to give an account of what is meant by innate, said that something is innate if there's no psychological explanation to be given for that structure's acquisition. He uses the word psychological explanation rather than learning because he thinks that there's more learning is only one type of psychological process. There are other psychological processes that are not learning, and he doesn't want to rule those out. But learning is a psychological process. Therefore, if something's acquired through learning, then it's not innate. And what he describes as non-psychological explanations would be things like maturation or brute cause triggering or hormonal changes. So they are basically explanations that lie outside the realm of cognitive psychology. They're explanations that might better be given from a biological standpoint or from a neurophysiological standpoint.
What's root cause triggering?
I was about to tell you. That's all right. Okay. So what Samuels means by brute cause triggering is something that comes back to Fodor. So much of it does. So brute cause triggering is when Fodor was trying to explain how we can acquire concepts without learning. And the idea is that we have experience of something in the world, and that triggers the concept in our mind. So I see a cow, and that triggers the cow concept. I know it sounds ridiculous, and I'm not going to go into it in very much detail right now. I just want to put it forward as this idea that it's a process that certainly doesn't seem to be psychological. It's C-stimulus effect happens in the brain. That concept is acquired. Another way that Fodor might put it is like a blow to the head. So you might get a blow to the head which causes you to think about cows. That wasn't a psychological process. It's some kind of trauma that you get which causes you, which brings that concept about. So brute cause kind of triggering has its foundations in Fodorian concept acquisition. The reason I pull it up here is it's meant to serve as a contrast to learning. So it's not that you are comparing a hypothesis or a set of hypotheses about what the best explanation could be for a particular thing that you've experienced in the world. It's more that you experience that thing and there's no choice about it. A particular set of concepts gets activated. Yeah, so psychological is tricky because I know that Samuels uses psychological because he wants to include learning in other processes. I think perhaps the best way to think about it is David Marr's computational level of analysis. So you've got psychological being kind of the computational description of what might go on. So process of inference, perhaps, or acquiring new information acquiring a new set of information from a particular experience. The line is fuzzy, and I can kind of see why he's leaving it fuzzy, but I think he's just trying to draw a distinction between just chemical changes and biological changes, which for someone like Samuels aren't quite the domain of psychology, they're the domain of neurology, so it's more the domain of understanding that which realizes a particular process, if that makes sense. But we can talk about that later. Okay, so when Carruthers talks about something being innately channeled, like a theory of mind being innately channeled, what he means is Richard Samuels' version of innate, i.e. there's no psychological explanation. There's no explanation to be given in terms of inferences or hypothesis testing for the acquisition of that structure. Although there may be an explanation that one can give in terms of, as I said, hormonal changes or a chemical change or maturation. And we know that this is what Carruthers means because he references Samuels all the time. So I'm confident in making that link. How does this deal? So we can see, how this deals with Carruthers' prioritized problem space. So as I said before, Carruthers thinks that the most important thing we need to explain is infants' precocious looking behavior in these studies. And this is a very nice way of explaining it because you say, well, it's innately structured. The infant doesn't have to learn anything from its environment. It's somehow already there. The knowledge is already there for the infant to look longer when someone acts in a way that doesn't cohere with her beliefs. So infants already have some kind of basic knowledge about beliefs which comes into play in these sorts of studies that we're seeing. When it comes to explaining the gap, when it comes to explaining why it is that infants perform in one way and 3- and 4-year-olds perform in another way, Carruthers maintains it's a performance, not a competence issue. So he thinks that all the way through we have a concept of false belief. It's just that concept isn't allowed to manifest itself because in these tasks where we're talking about where Sally hid her marble, there's too much other stuff going on for the child to keep track of. So he says that when you're doing a verbal false belief task, there's a triple load on your mind reading system. You have to keep a track of the character's false belief, but you also have to work out what this person is talking to you about, and that requires mind reading. So you have to keep track of this experimenter who's asking you questions. What does she want? And then you also have to generate an action that communicates to this person who's talking to you what's going to happen. And Carruthers says, look, this is just too much for a child to keep track of at the age of 3. But as their language acquisition and as their language competence improves, the kind of drain on the mind reading module becomes less, and this ability is able to manifest itself. So Carruthers thinks that from the age of 7 months, you've got the concept of false belief. It's just that any of these studies which involve something more than simply looking at one event or another, or looking longer at one thing than another, puts too much of a drain on the executive function, so that ability can't manifest itself. What about differences in development? So I said that that's what he prioritizes, but he kind of skips over some of the differences that I've been sort of talking about. What about deaf children with hearing parents? Well, there's 2 options here, I think, for Carruthers. And this is my speculation on how I think he can go with this. One is that he could say that deaf children with hearing parents lack the right sort of environmental cues to trigger the mind reading module. So by trigger, again, we're coming back to this sort of brute cause events where you have particular experience and that sets something in motion. So it's not learning, it's something that's already there that needs a kickstart with a cue from the environment. And it might be that perhaps overhearing language is the kickstart that you need to get your mind reading module up and running. And if you're a deaf child with hearing parents, so your kind of access to language is limited, then perhaps that cue isn't there, and therefore the mind reading module doesn't get up and running. Or he might want to say, well, deaf children with hearing parents lack the right experiences for their modules to start learning about mental states. So remember, I said earlier that Carruthers maintains that modules are domain-specific learning mechanisms. So you might want to say, well, the child has this kind of capacity to learn, the ability to learn about psychological states, but that ability can't manifest itself or is unable to develop properly because of an impoverished environment that that child is in. If you go with this one, then we're starting to shift quite a lot towards empiricism again. Again, it's beginning to be a bit harder to pull the 2 main views apart. I'm going to come back to this point as well. Okay. So how much if we go with the second option, which is that you lack the right experiences to start learning, then the question is, well, how much of a concession is this to learning and overall empiricism? Let's look at the alternative view. So back in the day, this guy, Noam Chomsky, thought I should probably do something to keep my supervisor happy. I should probably get a publication out there. I know what I'll do. I'll write a book review. Everyone likes book reviews. So he wrote this review, Verbal Behavior by Skinner. And this is one of the most important book reviews kind of in cognitive science, because it was this book review where Chomsky kind of leveled the underdetermination problem at Skinner, the underdetermination problem of how it is that we can learn behavioral rules. Because Skinner was saying sort of all our interactions are based on learning behavioral associations. And Chomsky said, well, there's just a massive underdetermination problem here. And that underdetermination problem has stayed with us. It's persisted through cognitive science until well, perhaps not until, perhaps that's an exaggeration, but until we properly understood the potential of Bayesian learning systems. So I think one of the reasons that the nativists kind of held the upper hand in the early 90s over the empiricists is that there weren't very good learning models out there. There just weren't very good accounts of how one could learn the required things that you needed to from the environment. But with the rise of Bayesian learning models, in more and more fields, scientists are able to kind of show how exposure to the right experiences allows you to learn quite complex abstract generalizations. So as Gopnik puts it, Bayesian learning provides some way of choosing between competing hypotheses to explain some data. And it also shows how the competing hypotheses can be limited from innumerable to several likely candidates. So Gopnik says that while many structures may be possible, some of the structures are going to be more likely than others. Bayesian methods give you a method of determining the probability of the possibilities. They tell you whether some hypothesis is more likely than others given the evidence. So roughly speaking, you start off with some hypotheses, but they are weighted already. The probability of those hypotheses, some probability is already assigned to those hypotheses. And that gives you some abilities, as Gopnik puts it, to choose between the alternatives to determine which of these hypotheses is more likely given the evidence that you've seen. You're not constructing each hypothesis from scratch each time. And Henry Wellman's version of account for mind reading is that children build models about the mind, and they do so using Bayesian methods. They do it by observation and interventions with the world, and in doing so, build up a theory about psychological states. Now, this theory building needn't happen at a kind of conscious or personal level. It could be happening to subpersonal level. Here are the main reasons that Wellman thinks this. He says, first, learning proceeds in orderly conceptual progressions, and both the sequences and the timings of the progressions are experience dependent. And finally, prior conceptual knowledge influences the presence and amount of learning, both enabling conceptual change given some prior understandings and constraining conceptual change given others. So, stage one, learning proceeds in orderly conceptual progressions. This is his theory of mind scale that we looked at before. A child starts out by being able to understand, well, at about 2.5 diverse desires, and goes through a sequence of stages until she gets to this stage of being able to understand hidden emotions. Point 2. The sequences and timings are experience dependent. So Wellman has done some work across cultures, and I did say that this scale is robust. The scale is robust, but we do see local changes. So for instance, the ability to understand ignorance and the ability to attribute diverse beliefs is switched for Chinese preschoolers and also for Iranian preschoolers. So they acquire knowledge access before they acquire the ability to attribute diverse beliefs. The explanation that Wellman gives for this is the greater emphasis that's placed on knowledge acquisition in Chinese cultures, which has been well documented in lots of papers. So Chinese parents emphasize learning about knowledge, emphasize knowledge as a good thing. And he believes that this different experience means that knowledge access emerges prior to diverse beliefs because talking about what people think is not such a prominent part of Asian cultures. Now, it might be, one could think, well, perhaps that's not the variable that's doing the necessary work here. Perhaps it's because lots of Chinese children are brought up as only children. Maybe that's got an influence there. And that's why the Iranian test study is quite a nice counter to that, because there you've also got a culture with a very strong emphasis on knowledge acquisition, less strong emphasis on psychological states, but big families. And we also see this with Iranian preschoolers, that their understanding of knowledge access comes prior to understanding that other people might have different beliefs to you. second bit of support that Wellman gives for this claim is the deaf children that we've talked about. And this goes beyond simply the implicit violation of expectation studies, but also more traditional false belief tasks too. And the claim is that these children have a kind of lack of evidence with which to build the correct theoretical constructs. So they're somehow not getting the right evidence from their experiences to build up their theory of psychological states. Finally, step 3, that prior conceptual knowledge influences the presence and amount of learning, which enables conceptual change, given some prior understandings, and constrains it, given others. So in support of this, Wellman puts forward longitudinal studies that he did with with children aged 3 years, 8 months on average. And these children could be split approximately into two groups. So at pre-testing, some of the children, about 50%, had got to this stage on the theory of mind scale. This is in America. So they understood diverse beliefs, but they couldn't do knowledge access yet. So they understood that other people could have different beliefs, but not that they could be ignorant. And the second group of children that they tested had got this far, so they did understand about ignorance, but neither group had got so far as being able to reason about false beliefs. And then what Wellman and his colleagues did was train these children. So they gave them 12 sessions over 6 weeks, where they saw a false belief task. And they were first of all asked to make the prediction, where will Sally look for her marble? And then they were shown the ending of the false belief task, with Sally looking in the basket, and asked to give an explanation. And the explanations varied quite a lot. But by the end of this kind of training session of being asked to give explanations over a series of about 6 weeks, what they discovered was children who were in group 2, children who could do knowledge access, then scored 100% on false belief tasks. So they progressed neatly to being able to understand false belief. But those children who were in group 1, who'd only got as far as diverse beliefs, all this training had no effect whatsoever. They still couldn't do false belief. They were still kind of completely at chance as to whether they could do it. So what Wellman's trying to say is where you are on this scale affects the next kind of set of hypotheses that you can grasp, the next set of concepts that you can get your head around. And that there's a kind of a sequence that you need to stick to. So you can't go from diverse desires to knowledge access. There's steps that you need to go through. And although there may be some local changes, for example, diverse beliefs and knowledge access switching, there's no evidence of, that's the only one that we have evidence of being a switch across cultures. Everything else needs to stay reasonably robust. So that's the evidence that he gives for that. So he just has this just quite a nice quote from Wellman here in response to this study, where he says, in a Bayesian fashion, children were prompted to consider their priors, their failed explanations. So remember, they were asked to give a prediction, and attempt to reconcile them with the evidence via attempted explanation. So Wellman very much has this view that the process of giving explanations is a really important part of theory building, because it's the process of in giving an explanation, you're kind of realizing that your prior prediction is wrong, and you're testing out a hypothesis that might possibly meet the data that you've been encountered with, this surprise of data that you've seen. And those children who were at the knowledge access stage could create explanations such that they got better. And he believes that this was one of the framing issues that allowed them to develop their theory of mind to the next stage, to being able to understand false beliefs. What about the early theory of mind tasks? Well, he gets around this by just saying that infants, they aren't indicative of infants understanding false belief. Instead, he thinks that they can be explained perfectly well by tracking the agent's desire, so what she wants, the watermelon, and also her knowledge state, that she's ignorant. And ignorance is an easier thing to track than belief, so ignorance is she just doesn't know. And that the child might have various hypotheses about how you should search for something if you're ignorant about it. So search where you last engaged with it, or search where the object belongs. Perhaps watermelon belongs in the green box, so that's where you should look for it. To be honest, I think this is the least strong aspect of Wellman's account, is how he accommodates this gap between infant ability and 4-year-old's ability. So, and I don't really want to talk about it because I've not had a chance to think about it and give him the strongest position to accommodate this gap, because I just don't think it works at the moment. But, okay, so I'm going to leave that for now. However, his story about the improvement in children's development when it comes to explicit response tasks, when it comes to pointing at something or verbally giving an explanation, seems quite persuasive, this idea of theory building. Okay. So last 10 minutes, do I have 10 minutes? We started a bit late, or, yeah. The last 10 minutes I want to look at the differences between the view. So here's a quote from Carruthers. In light of her most recent position, Gopnik's most recent position, it might be possible for Gopnik to claim that there are multiple statistical learning mechanisms in the human mind capable of extracting underlying causal structure, one for mind reading, one for physical forces, one for biological kinds, and so forth. Notice, however, that the upshot would be indistinguishable from a form of modular account, for it would postulate an innate specialized learning mechanism designed for mind reading. So although Carruthers is referring to Gopnik here, Gopnik and Wellman hold very similar views, and the point applies just as well to Wellman, I think. And here's the question, well, if modules are learning mechanisms, then can we simply see Wellman's constructivist account as just filling in the gaps, giving an account by which these modules acquire information about the environment? In which case, these views are compatible. They're not fighting each other at all. So here's one place where we might see the difference. The difference could be with the priors, so the probabilities assigned to prior hypotheses that you have when it comes to testing and working out which hypothesis is the most likely for the data that you're seeing. Could the weightings assigned to those priors be innately specified? And if they're innately specified, i.e., like for now, let's just say they're not learned via Bayesian processes, then perhaps that gives the nativist kind of a more strong, more firm grounding, or at least more grounding to say, look, I'm different. On a nativist account, yes, there's learning, and possibly that learning happens in a Bayesian way, but the priors of the hypotheses are innately specified. So what experience does, it allows you to kind of change the weightings of those priors a little bit, but there's, if you like, a factory setting that says these certain set of hypotheses is more likely. If we go this way, then we get back to an echo of the earlier debate, which is how much innate stuff is there. So if we agree that there are priors, then, and the argument is simply about, well, are the weightings of those priors set innately or not, then we can kind of see echoes with what was going on before when we were talking about how many cognitive structures are innate, not whether there are any innate cognitive structures. And this is a view that's kind of supported by Brian Scholl, who's broadly speaking a modular theorist. So he seems to think that modules are learning mechanisms and that there might be certain kind of hypotheses which come with what he calls factory settings, so innate specifications of the likelihood of certain hypotheses, but experience will allow you to change those likelihoods. So it doesn't preclude learning in this way. Applying this to theory of mind, there's a correlation here, and I wasn't quite sure what to make of it, so I'm just going to put it out for now. So there's a divide between whether what we have is one system or two for mind reading. And that seems to map onto the nativist empiricist debate. So nativist accounts seem to all be committed to this view that there's one core theory of mind module, and that's the thing that infants are using. It's innately channeled, and what's happening when the infant develops is that that ability becomes easier to manifest because executive function is reduced. And that core system can be supplemented by learning, but it's all still part of one system. And that contrasts with kind of empiricist accounts like Wellman's, which seem to say, no, there's two systems which exist in parallel. So I said that Wellman didn't think that infants could attribute beliefs to others. He believes that they're using a much more basic psychological process. They're attributing more basic psychological states like desire and ignorance. And he thinks that that's one system that you have for interacting with other psychological states. And it exists in parallel with a more complex system which doesn't get developed till later, possibly till you have language, but certainly when you're starting to interact with the world, which allows you to track more complicated psychological states like beliefs. So if you believe that there are two systems, then there's two ways you can go. So you can say that both of them come about through Bayesian kind of learning, and that's what Wellman seems to think. So he thinks the strategy used by infants comes about through learning, and the strategy that we use as adults and as developing children also comes through learning. And others seem less sure of this. So I think someone like Ian Appley would think that the first system, the one that infants use, is innately channeled, but the second one comes about through learning. Can early mind reading be acquired through Bayesian learning hypothesis testing? Carruthers obviously thinks no, but Wellman thinks yes, and he's very taken by this data with deaf infants of hearing parents to suggest that there is experience-dependent learning, even on this implicit kind of very basic mind reading level that allows you to pass the infant false belief tasks. Now, note here that when Peter Carruthers says the evidence of very early mind reading would raise a significant problem for learning account of this sort, he's talking about Bayesian learning, I think, like kind of hypothesis testing. But he's not denying the role of experience. He's just saying that the role of experience, the relationship between experience and mind reading is not one of learning. It's probably something else. And this is when we come back to kind of alternatives. So one could argue that, so it's clear that experience changes cognition, but if you're on the nativist side, you're going to say the way in which it changes isn't through Bayesian learning. And that's compatible with the modular position. You could go that way. There's two possibilities of spelling it out. You could say that they aren't learning processes at all, but again, back to these brute causal relations that I mentioned earlier. So perhaps it's simply the case that you have an experience in the world and that this triggers some kind of ability that's there, but is dormant. It's just waiting to be started. In which case, that's not properly described as learning. That's a kind of stimulus response sort of approach. Or the second possibility might be non-Bayesian learning. So there is other types of learning hypothesis out there. So there's kind of perceptual learning that Rob Goldstone maintains is different from Bayesian. And I think Elizabeth Spelke develops a view like this too. I don't know very much about those, so I'd rather not talk about them, but just show that those are possibilities, those are ways for the nativist to go. But are these possibilities empirically tractable? So this brings us to the question of what kind of empirical work is going to help us. We've got these two views on the table, one which has got a very heavy emphasis on learning, and one which is trying to say, well, there's more innate stuff. And there is stuff that's learned, but we're going to kind of hedge our bets as to what kind of learning mechanism is going on there. So babies are useful to a certain extent, particularly looking at babies from lots and lots of different cultures. But I wonder if babies have got us into a stalemate now, if babies have exhausted their capacity for telling us things. And that maybe we should be looking at simulations. So until 2005, or rather in the past decade, we've got a much clearer idea of the sorts of distinctions that babies can make. So the arguments are about what it is that enables them to make those distinctions. But we don't know very much yet about it. And I wonder whether simulations might be the way to go, because then we can sort of set up simulation models to try and get to the endpoint that we see, say, in a 5-month-old infant or a 7-month-old infant when it can look longer at one thing rather than another, and test it out with learning hypotheses. So see whether, from its experience, a simulation from its experience can learn the relevant hypotheses to generate the kind of results that we see in infants. So can we create learning models that match infants' capabilities? And if the answer is yes, then we find out more about what kind of priors there might be, what kind of initial hypotheses the infant might start off with. We say, if the answer is no, well, perhaps that's an advantage to nativism. We could say, well, the theory of mind is innately specified. Or we could say, well, perhaps we got the hypotheses wrong and we need to alter our starting hypotheses. But I think this might be a more beneficial way to make progress in this particular debate, in the particular mind reading debate. It certainly helped with perception, so I don't see why it shouldn't help here. And I think we're beginning to be in a position that we can use this data because we have so much of a richer view of what it is that infants can do. I'm just going to skip that. Okay. So in conclusions, babies are useful. Babies have their uses. They've given us a lot of really rich data in the past 10 years that accounts of mind reading have to accommodate. But perhaps babies have sort of not reached their limitations, but we should be looking at other types of data and not just what we're getting from the infant labs. And I think now is a good time to be doing that, and I'm not sure of anyone who is pursuing kind of mind reading outside the baby lab. A cognitive ability that appears early in development and universally doesn't entail that it's an innate cognitive ability. It's good evidence, but it's not logically necessary. And a cognitive ability that's affected by the environment and experience does not entail that it is not innate. So if you've got something that changes with the environment, that doesn't mean that it isn't innate. So the point is that both nativists and empiricists have to accommodate rigid structures and also learning. And both of the accounts out there seem to be able to do that. So have we reached an empirical stalemate on that point? Because it seems that both of these views are yielding very similar predictions, and both of them can comfortably accommodate the main sources of data. Simulations might be useful, so perhaps we should look elsewhere. Nativists need to be clear about how they're construing this link between environment and development, because if it becomes learning heavy, then they move closer to the empiricists than they thought. But if they want to construe it not as learning, but perhaps as this kind of brute causal triggering or something not learned, whatever it is, they need to tell us what they think that relation is. And getting clearer on the gap between what infants can do and 4-year-olds can do, I think could provide insights into innateness, because at least it will give us some indication of a very specific ability, the ability of attributing false beliefs to others, give us some indication whether that is the kind of thing that could be innate. And if it turns out that it's a masking that's going on, that the competence is there but not being manifested, then that speaks more towards false belief being a candidate for being innate. And I think that's all I wanted to say.